Good morning. Welcome to the pre-party for Friday, November 15th. I realized that in class on Wednesday, we didn't go back to the food safety lecture and finish talking about the bacteria. So I'm going to finish that up now. I didn't want to do it on Wednesday because I knew we had some exciting stuff to cover with the alternative meat choices. But this should go fairly quick, and I will note that the majority of the exam questions that might show up on food safety will be what we covered in class, but I will pull some of the things I talk about here on the pre-party, so that should help you focus on how you're going to study for the exam, which will be coming up. So we ended on Monday talking about norovirus. That was the only virus that was found on the top 10 pathogenic organism list. Everything else was bacteria. Norovirus is interesting that it's the leading cause of illness and outbreaks from contaminated food. So it's very highly seen, and that's because it's transferred from person to person very easily. Okay, we ourselves have millions of viral particles. Our most common infection reservoir are infected food workers. So this is extremely important that if you work in the food industry, if you are feeling ill, it is not likely a good idea to go to work because you could very easily shed norovirus and cause infection in the people who eat the food you produce. Fortunately, though, symptoms don't really last for very long. 1 to 3 days, you get over it. Those being diarrhea, vomiting, and stomach pain. And really, if you find yourself infected with norovirus, the easiest treatment is to keep yourself hydrated through fluids. Salmonella is the next bacterial that causes a common foodborne illness. It's the most common bacterial cause. Okay, so norovirus is the leading cause. Salmonella is the the leading cause of bacterial illness. We see it causes the most foodborne illness-related deaths in the U.S. We see about 1.4 million cases per year, deaths upward around that 450 mark. Symptoms include your common stomach cramps, diarrhea. We don't really see a ton of vomiting, but we do get to develop fever, and those can develop anywhere from 12 to 72 hours after you eat salmonella-infected food. But fortunately, usually a week-long incidence is really where you're going to max out, and then you'll continue to get better. Okay. One important thing to talk about is that salmonella comes from raw and undercooked eggs and meat, fish, some fruits and vegetables, and then raw dairy products. So really that raw state of food, we haven't had the opportunity to kill salmonella through a cooking process, and so we see incidences that can result. Disregard the last bullet, that was last year's salmonella outbreak, but we have seen a recent salmonella outbreak, really the strain, the Dublin. This has caused 10 people to be infected, so therefore it is an outbreak. The Dublin strain is a little bit more severe than other salmonella species, and so that is why it's kind of a concern. But we still don't know where the salmonella outbreak has originated. They're still in the investigative stage. The first case was seen in August and then got into September, so it's an ongoing process to investigate this. Next species we see is Shigella. There are about just under 450,000 cases of Shigella infection per year. It really comes from salads, unclean water, and then again food handled by an infected person. Okay, so it's again important that if you're handling food and you're ill, not to do so because you could cause infection in other people. This one, like salmonella, takes about 7 days to get over. That is after you develop or let it incubate in your body for about 1 to 2 days. Then you start to see symptoms of diarrhea, vomiting, stomach pain. We as humans are not actually a host, we are a host, whereas animals do not necessarily become infected with Shigella. That is why it's pretty common human to human infection, not necessarily animal to human infection. And then the last species on our top 10 list was Staphylococcus aureus, or if you've ever had a staph infection, that's kind of what we're talking about here. 25% of people have staph on their skin or in their nose. It's a very common bacterial for us. It usually doesn't cause illness. However, once Staphylococcus creates a toxin, mainly an enterotoxin, that's when we start to see sickness arrive. So again, this is an intoxication, not an infection. The toxin is very heat stable, which becomes a problem because you can't necessarily cook it out. So it's important to understand when that toxin might form. Staphylococcus being very normal to us. It doesn't happen very often though. Usually where a Staph aureus infection or intoxication comes from is cooked hams, salads, bakery products, or dairy products. We get the standard symptoms of diarrhea, vomiting, stomach cramps, so we will get over those, but it's a very quick incubation period. It usually only lasts about a day, so sometimes Staph aureus is not reported because it is such a quick turnover from illness to back to normal. And it's very rare to see severe illness. So you might not even realize you have a Staph aureus infection. The staph infections you usually hear about that are severe are a different strain. So some people have had some surgeries and it's not a clean, sanitized surgery procedure. They'll get staph infection and cause a lot more symptoms. Okay. So some non-bacterial foodborne pathogens that are not necessarily on the top 10 list, but something to make note of. There are parasites. We see protozoa that are found in the intestinal tracts of animals. Those are shed into the feces in the form of a cyst, and then that cyst can develop if consumed by another species. So an example would be Giardia that exists quite frequently in natural mountain springs or natural waters. Toxoplasma gondii comes from cats. Cats tend to usually eat other things' feces and grasses that have been infected by feces, so they can transmit that toxoplasma. And then Cryptosporidium is again another protozoa that can be transferred from an indirect host. One that's common to food was common to food, is no longer common anymore, was the Trichinella spiralis, which caused trichinosis. It was an encapsulated larvae found in the muscle of rats, dogs, cats, swine, horses, game animals, particularly bears, and then it got transmitted to humans. It came from consuming improperly cooked meat. So that's why a lot of hunters who go harvest a bear do not eat bear, because it's more common for bear to be infected by the trichina organism. However, you can still consume it if you cook the meat to at least 144 degrees, because that is killed instantly. We used to have a lot of problem with it in swine because swine were fed garbage. The swine we are consuming today are fed very high quality diets. It's not kind of the leftovers, so we're not seeing incidents of trichina very much anymore. So here are some solutions to foodborne illness, and I will let you kind of read through here, but your two main takeaway points are: wash your hands before you handle food, and cook your food to the proper temperature. And usually that's 160 degrees for a ground product, 165 degrees for ground poultry product, and then a minimum of 140 on the safe side for intact products, so something like a steak or a roast. Okay, so now let's switch gears. I want to provide you a roadmap for the rest of the semester, because unfortunately we are about done together, and that makes me pretty sad because I've really enjoyed this semester, but we do have a lot planned for the remaining weeks we do have. We will start Friday with our egg section, spend 2 days on that, then transition into candy. So you'll realize the course schedule has changed a bit. So if you need to do some updating in your planner, please take what you have on this slide and do that updating. Then we will spend the remaining of the semester on the milk and dairy product section that will cover about 6 days. Within that, you have one quiz that's December 13th, so right before finals. Remember, quizzes are pretty low stakes, 25 points, and then 2 exams. Your most upcoming one is next Friday. I will be out next Friday, so you will take the exam, someone will be there to give it to you, and then you are free to go. And then lastly, the final. Reminder, if after December 13th's quiz you have an A in the class, you do not have to take the final. If you do not have an A, you will take the final, and that should help improve the grade and help you achieve the grade that you want. One last thing to kind of mention on the syllabus, the top assignment point breakdown is what I provided you at the beginning of the semester. I had some poor planning on my part, I will say that. So I went back through and kind of figured out really where we were at from Wednesday and where we're going to the end of the semester, and it looks like our IRATs and TRATs will not equate to 200 points. I was definitely overestimating that. My apologies. So we will have 102 points worth of IRATs, still a fairly large percentage grade. The peer evaluation, the quizzes, and the exams all stay the same. So just know that IRAT and TRAT point total will not get to where I originally thought. Now, if you have a problem with this point breakdown change, please come talk to me. I realize that my planning prior to the semester did not translate into what the semester actually would be, and so I want to be very transparent in that and make sure we're all on the same page. With that, let's transition into our discussion of eggs. The pre-party here is to really just involve you in what an egg actually is and talk about the different varieties so that way we can proceed on Friday. Starting with the parts of an egg, let's go through inside to outside. So starting with the germinal disc, you see that little white dot on the yolk. If you crack open an egg, the white dot is usually very visible. This germinal disc is where the site where sperm enters the yolk and fertilizes the egg, if sperm is present in the hen's laying cycle. The yolk then, that's kind of associated with that germinal disc, contains mainly our fat component of the egg. Cholesterol is one of those, so those individuals who are trying to decrease the amount of dietary cholesterol they consume often avoid egg yolks just because they are pretty high in lipid content. However, that lipid content allows nutrients to be passed to the developing fetus if this egg were to be fertilized by the rooster's sperm. Then we have the vitelline membrane, which is the membrane that surrounds the yolk layer. This membrane essentially keeps the yolk from seeping in the whole egg form, and when we crack open the shell and let that egg kind of disperse on a frying pan, etc. Then that vitelline membrane is kind of tied or associated with what we call chalaza. Those chalaza are kind of two ropes at the ends of the yolk that stabilize the yolk. We want that yolk to kind of stay central in the eggshell. As an egg ages, the yolk will transition in position. That's because the chalaza start to break down and cause less stability. If you crack open a really fresh egg, you will be able to see that chalaza. It'll be very, very visible to you. Then moving outward to kind of our outer portion, we start with the egg white or the albumin. This is what makes up about 60% of the egg's weight, and its function is to protect the yolk and provide protein. Okay, so eggs are typically thought of very highly nutritious foods because the yolk provides a fat source and the egg white provides a protein source. We see that the albumin is split into two different layers. We have a thick layer and a thin layer. Younger eggs, or those that have not sat in the refrigerator for a while, tend to have a murkier egg white because it contains more CO2. That CO2 has not been able to escape out of the shell. On the flip side, older eggs, CO2 can migrate out over time, and so we see a more translucent egg white. Older eggs also won't hold the shape as well when we crack them open. The thin membrane will become thinner, and that thick membrane will become thinner, and so it'll spread out more upon cracking. Then we have the inner membrane, which is that orange membrane you see. It's the strongest protective barrier for bacteria. So if bacteria are on the outside of the eggshell, which is likely there are, especially if those hens lay on the ground, that bacteria can get through the shell and it can get through the outer membrane, but it really has a hard time getting through the inner membrane. And this is just a biological protective function that the egg has created for itself to maintain the viability of a healthy embryo. The outer membrane really allows gases to travel in and out. Oxygen has to come in, CO2 has to go out. So the outer membrane allows diffusion of those two gases. Again, it will help some with bacterial protection, but some bacteria do get through there. But that's okay because the inner membrane is really going to be the definitive stopping point. We see that there's an air cell at the bottom side of every egg, and that's because once the hen lays the egg, the temperature around the egg starts to cool. It's not anymore at body temperature, and so that causes the inner membrane to suck up and create an air cell at the bottom of the egg. This is very easily seen on a hard-boiled egg. If you boil it in water, break open the shell, you'll see kind of a platform start to develop. And then lastly, we see the shell. On the shell, although we can't see it with our visible eye, there are about 7,000 to 17,000 very semi-permeable pores. This is what allows bacteria in or out, not necessarily a good thing, but it allows air exchange, so oxygen and CO2 in and out, so it's necessary that these pores are there. So that wraps up parts of an egg. Some of you may not be familiar with how eggs are processed once they are collected from the hen's house and then put into the grocery store. So I encourage you to watch this video. It really does a great job explaining how that egg process happens. It happens, most eggs are shipped out the same day they are laid. So it's a very quick process and we can get that speed because of automation. One thing to note is that on the outside of the shell, there is a cuticle layer, often called the bloom. During egg processing, the bloom is washed off. So when doing that, we expose more and more of those pores to allow bacteria to come in. So we lose a protective barrier. Now, we only really wash that bloom off if we run water over it and scrape it off or brush it off. So if you have hens at home and you don't necessarily clean your eggs, you just collect them, it's okay to store those on the countertop because that bloom is still preventing bacteria from entering. However, if you wash the eggs, you'll want to store them in the refrigerator to try to minimize bacterial growth. Okay, and then last couple slides, I just want to cover egg characteristics. I think it's very known that you can buy white or brown eggs at the grocery store. There was once a debate whether brown eggs were healthier than white eggs or vice versa. There are no nutritional differences. They really just change in color based on hen color. So hens that have white feathers lay white eggs. Hens that have brown or red feathers lay brown eggs. Okay, so something to keep in mind. It's a common myth within the egg industry. Then we can buy different sizes of eggs, small to jumbo. Hens who are larger tend to lay larger eggs because they can create more larger space, larger fluid around that albumin. Older hens tend to lay larger eggs, okay? And if we think about nutritionally, if we feed that hen at a higher plane of nutrition, they will also develop larger eggs. Looking at egg size, we have small, medium, large, extra large, and jumbo. Those are the options. And we see that there are different protein levels, different fat levels, different carbohydrate levels, different potassium, sodium, and sugar levels within those sizes. So this could dictate your consumer buying decision. Do you really need jumbo eggs? Well, if you're trying to maximize protein, cook fewer eggs, jumbo eggs are the way to go. If your recipe calls for large eggs, it makes sense that you would buy large eggs because that recipe requires a certain amount of fat and protein, and determine the large egg is going to provide that for you, okay? So I will see you on Friday. We're going to do some egg shopping, so I look forward to seeing what you decide to buy based on certain scenarios.